Between 1884 and 1885, there was something that happened in Berlin. It was called the Berlin Conference. It was convoked by a man called Otto von Bismarck, who was the first chancellor of Germany. Bismarck put all this together, and according to so many historians, what happened at the Berlin Conference was Africa was brought on the table like a cake, a piece of cake, and the colonial masters took up their knives and cut Africa into different pieces and shared Africa amongst themselves on the table. That was the conference at which Africa was destroyed completely. It was at that conference that they drew the maps that we recognize today in Africa. It was there that they decided that we have to have boundaries and that we must observe all those boundaries. It was at that Berlin conference. So the boundaries you have in Africa today, the map that you have of Africa today, our ancestors from Africa never contributed in any way to all that thing that you see today. It was the colonial masters who sat down between 1884 and 1885 and decided that we must have boundaries to divide ourselves. And so when they were done with that, of course, they flooded the African continent with their intelligence agents to make sure that they instill these divisions in our minds psychologically and otherwise, okay? Because if the divisions are there and they don't get etched in our consciousness, it wouldn't make any difference. So they had to come and make sure that those things are observed in our psyche, in the consciousness of the African man. So I can begin to tell the man who is from Zambia, I say, how dare you talk about my country? You are from Zambia. And the Ghanaian person can look at the man from Congo and say, shut up, this is a Ghanaian affair. You have no reason to get involved. And then the man that is from Togo will tell the guy from Benin Republic, how dare you get involved in our matter? Africans became divided not only by boundaries, but also psychologically in their minds. And you wonder why South Africans are killing their own kind. Let's go down more to history. And so after they had succeeded in dividing Africa and ensuring that Africans also became divided in their psyche, in their consciousness, what they did more was colonial activity increased on the African continent. It was almost looking worse than the days of slavery. And so the cries for independence began to rise up from all over the place. Now, between the 1950s and the 1960s, independence was the only thing that everybody was talking about. And so the United Nations had a resolution. It was called the UN Resolution 1514. That was a resolution that granted colonial countries and peoples independence. And it was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December the 14th, 1960. 89 countries voted in favor, none voted against. But these countries, I'm going to read them out for you. These countries abstained from voting. They said they would not vote. Australia, Belgium, Dominican Republic, France, Portugal, Spain, Union of South Africa, United Kingdom, and the United States. Of course, until Donald Trump came down, the United States had always been controlled by the United Kingdom. So wherever United Kingdom went, America also went with it. But as for having a colony in Africa, I don't know of any colony that America controls in Africa. But they refused to vote because the United Kingdom refused to vote. France, Portugal, UK, look at Union of South Africa, refused. They abstained from voting. Even though they abstained from voting, France and the other colonial masters still accepted that the colonies in Africa should have their independence, but people did not know that this was ceremonial independence. For instance, France has 14 colonies in Africa. And so they allowed for their colonies to have independence. But look what France did. France went behind and signed a very satanic agreement with them. It is called a Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. Can you imagine that? A pact for the continuation of colonization. And these African countries signed this with France. And by virtue of that agreement, they agreed to impose the colonial currency, which is called the FCFA, franc for the colonies of France in Africa. They signed that they were going to impose it on these 14 African colonies of France. But that's not all. Number two, they agreed to maintain the French school and military system in all of these countries. But that's not all. They also agreed to maintain French as an official language in all of these colonies. And that has remained up until this very day. These African countries are then further obliged by force to store up 85% of their foreign exchange reserve in Banque de France, which is located in Paris, and must be under the strict and direct control of the French treasury. And so they are left with only 15%, which is nothing at all for it. Even a few states cannot handle that, let alone a nation. So what that means is that they will never be able to have enough. Now, because they don't have enough, they are then compelled to go back to the same French treasury to borrow money. And when they borrow from them, France lends to them from their treasury. France then lends back to these nations at market rates with interest. And the moment that happens, these nations are now indebted. They begin to owe France officially. And that's the history of how African nations are now called debtor nations. This is just France. This is the same thing for Britain. It's the same thing for Portugal. France is just a blueprint because a German newspaper just broke the news. So this is how all of them operate, including Nigeria and all the other colonies.
The French treasury, for example, is receiving about $500 billion year in, year out, in foreign exchange reserves from African countries based on colonial debt they forced them to pay. Former French President Jacques Chirac stated in an interview recently that we have to be honest and acknowledge that a big part of the money in our banks comes precisely from the exploitation of the African continent. In 2008, he stated that without Africa, France will slide down in the rank of a third world power.
They call it colonial tax. So every year, these same African countries, 14 of them, have to pay France for coming to colonize them when they did. So we are paying France for colonization, and France says that, oh, it is because they built infrastructure in these African countries when they colonize them. So they have to keep paying for the rest of their lives, generation upon generation. So now, I want you to take a look. I want you to take a look at the amount of money that went into this same Banque de France in Paris in 2012 alone from our African countries who are regarded as debtor nations. Have you seen that? Those figures were just for 2012. Now imagine what those figures are in 2019. Monies that went to them. But that's not all that France does to these countries. In addition to all these wicked shackles on our nations, wherever new natural resources are discovered in any one of these nations, France has the right of first refusal. Let me give you an example. If, say, for instance, Togo has gold, and we know Togo for gold, and suddenly they discover oil, the government in Togo has no right to decide what happens to their oil on their own. France will have the right of first refusal. France must be on ground to decide with the government, and in fact to impose on the government what will happen to the new natural resource that has just been discovered in that nation. They will be the ones to either mine or the one to either do the exploration of whatever has been discovered. But that's not all. It hasn't stopped there. You remember all these juicy contracts that come out from different governments in different countries, especially in Africa. All those big government contracts. France is the first to be considered in any one of these 14 countries in case there is any government contract coming out. What that means is that if, for instance, Togo or Central African Republic or Benin Republic has about 20 solid government contracts, French companies will at least be considered for about 90% of those. It is only the crumbs that will now be sent to all the other companies to do. And so I'm going to ask you just one very simple question. If you have conscience, given all that I have detailed so far at this very point now, tell me in all honesty, in sincerity, what do you think these African countries are left to run their nations with? The former president of Gambia, Yahya Jammeh. I know many of you don't have a lot of good things to say about him, but that's how it is with Africa. That's how they killed our man, Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi, and everybody bad-mouthing him because the man nationalized the oil of his country and the natural resources, and the money was staying in the country, wasn't going to the colonial anybody. And so the country people, the Libyans, ordinary Libyans, were living like kings, better than people who were even living in Europe, because their own oil money was staying back in the country. So when they framed him and took him out of the way, Africans were the ones bad-mouthing them. And so Yahya Jammeh said that his problem was because he refused to accept 5% royalty on the natural resources that God had given to Gambia.
We have minerals. We've not started exploiting them. We have petroleum. We have not started exploiting it because we disagree with. Some of my crimes are to say we are not going to accept 5% royalty. They tell me, oh, all African countries have accepted that. And in fact, they told me that no African country except three countries get more than 3% from their minerals. And so they think that that is a rule that all Africans must accept, and tell them you are in the wrong country.
They offered him 5% royalty. Let me explain. You remember when I just told you that France has the right of first refusal on any new natural resources discovered in all these African nations that they control. What it means, like, for instance, oil is discovered. When a French company comes in to be the ones to do the exploration of that oil, or to mine gold or whatever, out of all they make from that mining, from that natural resource in your country, they are giving your country, not your president, not his children, not his village people. No, they are giving the entire nation only 5% royalty from that same natural resource that they are making trillions of dollars from. That's what they offered Yahya Jammeh. And the guy said, for what? They looked at him in the face and they said, Why are you rejecting 5%? Do you know that there are not more than 3 African countries who receive more than 3% royalty? In other words, only about 3 African countries actually receive more than 3% royalty. 5% is the highest. And there are only 3 African countries that receive that 5%. And Yahya Jammeh was being told, how can you be receiving something that there are not even more than 3 of you that receive in Africa? You can imagine the story of Nigeria. When you hear something like this, what are you thinking already? You can imagine Nigeria may not even be up to 3%. Because the person they have put in power now is like colonial masters sitting there in Aso Rock by themselves. So it may not even be up to. That's why money cannot get to the people. A nation that is supposedly the 6th largest exporter of oil cannot take care of its citizens, does not have a highway. You have the highest number of poor people on earth in that same nation. How?